The hospital was eerily quiet that night. The long, dimly lit hallways stretched endlessly, with only the soft hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of night shift nurses breaking the silence. Most of the staff were finishing up their rounds, preparing for the last few hours of their shift. In the hospital cafe, a young chef named Daniel took a brief pause, sipping on a freshly brewed cup of coffee. Daniel wasn't anyone extraordinary, just a hard-working man who loved his job and had a soft spot for people. He took pride in preparing fresh, nutritious meals for patients and often made special dishes for the hospital staff. But tonight was different. Something unsettling was about to happen, something that would change his life forever. As he took another sip, something caught his eye at the far end of the hallway. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, was walking alone. That in itself was strange, but there was something about her. Her slow, deliberate steps, the way her hospital gown trailed behind her, and her unkempt hair. She looked lost, yet oddly determined, as if she knew exactly where she was going. Daniel frowned. A child wandering the hospital halls this late at night? That wasn't normal. He glanced around, expecting to see a nurse or a guardian nearby, but there was no one. Something didn't feel right. The girl kept walking until she reached a particular room. Daniel felt an unexplainable pull in his gut, a sense that he needed to follow her. So, he did. As he neared the room, he noticed the nameplate on the door. Amelia Carter. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had heard about Amelia Carter. She had been in a coma for months after a terrible accident. Doctors had long given up hope of her waking up, though the nurses still cared for her with unwavering dedication. But why was this child entering her room? The girl gently pushed the door open and slipped inside. Daniel hesitated. His instincts screamed at him that something was off. Slowly, he stepped closer, peering in through the slight gap in the doorway. He couldn't see much. The privacy curtain obscured most of the room. But then, he heard something, a faint whisper. Then before Daniel could react, something happened. Something so unexpected, so impossible, that it sent a shiver down his spine. Nurse Julia, who had been making her rounds, also noticed the slightly open door. A strange feeling crept over her. Something wasn't right. She quickly stepped inside, and the moment her eyes landed on what was happening, she let out a sharp gasp. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her radio, but instead of calling security, she reached for her phone and dialed 911. What had she seen? What was happening inside that room? And most importantly, who was that little girl? Tonight, a long-buried secret was about to be uncovered. But was everyone ready for the truth? Nurse Julia's hands trembled as she clutched her phone. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she tried to steady her breath. She could barely process what she was seeing. Amelia Carter had been lying in this hospital bed for months, completely unresponsive. But now something was different. The little girl stood beside the bed, her tiny fingers resting gently on Amelia's hand. And for the first time since her accident, Amelia moved. It wasn't much. A slight twitch of her fingers, the faintest flutter of her eyelids. But it was enough to send a chill down Julia's spine. She had been working in this hospital long enough to know what was possible and what wasn't. And this wasn't possible. Daniel, still standing at the doorway, felt a knot form in his stomach. He had seen the girl go inside, but now that he was looking at her up close, something felt off. Her hospital gown looked slightly worn, like it had been washed too many times. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the fluorescent lights, and her eyes, dark, deep, filled with something unreadable, never once left Amelia Julia. finally found her voice. "Sweetheart, what are you doing in here?" she asked, trying to keep her tone gentle. But the girl didn't answer. She didn't even look at her. Instead, she leaned in closer to Amelia, whispered something that neither Julia nor Daniel could hear. And then, just like that, she turned and walked past them, out the door, disappearing down the hallway. Julia hesitated for only a second before rushing toward Amelia's bed. Her fingers instinctively reached for her pulse, her eyes scanning the monitors. Everything looked the same. No major changes, no sudden spikes or drops. But she knew what she had seen. Amelia had moved. Daniel exhaled slowly, still shaken. "Who was that kid?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Julia shook her head. "I don't know, but I need to check the records. We don't have any patients her age in this unit, and certainly not wandering around alone at this time of night." She grabbed the hospital's patient log and flipped through the pages. Her hands grew clammy as she reached the pediatric records. There was no one matching the girl's description. No one had been admitted recently who looked even remotely like her. Julia swallowed hard. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Maybe she's a visitor, someone's kid." "Visiting hours ended hours ago," Julia said, her voice uneasy. "And no one lets a child wander alone in an intensive care unit." A sudden thought struck her. What if the security cameras had picked up something? She turned toward Daniel, her expression serious. "We need to check the surveillance footage." Daniel nodded, though he wasn't sure he wanted to see whatever that camera had captured. But something about that girl. It felt like she had stepped out of a dream or a nightmare. They made their way to the security office, where the night guard, an older man named Frank, sat with his feet up, sipping from a can of soda. He raised an eyebrow when he saw their anxious faces. "What's going on?" Julia wasted no time. "We need to see the footage from the last 20 minutes. Hallway outside room 209. Frank frowned but didn't ask questions. He turned to the monitors and rewound the footage. Julia and Daniel leaned in, their eyes fixed on the screen. The video played. The hallway was empty at first. Then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the little girl appeared. She walked slowly, her bare feet soundless against the cold tile. She never hesitated, never looked around. She moved with purpose. Straight to Amelia Carter's room. Julia felt her breath catch in her throat. The way the girl walked, it was too calm, too deliberate. They watched as the girl slipped inside the room. Several minutes passed. Then she reappeared, walking back out. But something was wrong. Frank squinted at the screen. "Wait a minute," he muttered, rewinding the footage and playing it again. He pointed at the monitor. "Look at that." Julia and Daniel stared. The girl was walking out of the room, but in the reflection of the polished hospital floor, there was nothing, no reflection. Daniel took a step back. His skin prickled. "That's not possible." Julia's mind raced. "Rewind further," she said, her voice barely steady. "Go back to when she first appeared." Frank did as she asked. They watched in silence as the footage played in reverse. But when it reached a certain point, just before the girl should have stepped into view, she wasn't there. It was as if she had materialized out of nowhere. No doors opened, no corners turned. 1 second, the hallway was empty, and the next, she was just there. A heavy silence filled the room. Frank leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I don't know what kind of joke this is, but I don't like it." "It's not a joke," Julia whispered. "She was real. We both saw her." Daniel, still staring at the screen, suddenly had a thought. He turned to Julia. What if she wasn't just visiting Amelia? Julia's heart pounded. What do you mean? Daniel swallowed. What if she was here because of her? The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. They turned back to the monitor. The black and white image frozen on the screen. The little girl, walking away, her feet soundless, her reflection non-existent. And then, as if to answer their unspoken fears, an alarm suddenly blared through the hospital. A patient's vitals had changed. Julia spun on her heel and ran, Daniel right behind her. As they reached Amelia Carter's room, they saw nurses and doctors already gathered around her bed, checking her monitors, speaking in hushed but urgent voices. And then, as if the night hadn't already been filled with enough impossibilities, Amelia Carter gasped. Her eyes fluttered open. The room fell silent. Amelia, the girl who had been in a coma for months, was awake. But when she looked around the room, her lips trembled. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Where is she? Julia felt ice creep down her spine. Who, Amelia? Amelia turned her head slowly, her tired eyes filled with something unreadable. The little girl. She was just here. Daniel's breath caught. Julia's hands clenched at her sides. And deep down, they both knew. Whatever had happened tonight, it was only the beginning. The room was silent. Every nurse, every doctor, even Daniel and Julia stood frozen, their eyes locked. On Amelia, the beeping of the heart monitor was steady now, but the tension in the air was anything but. Amelia's lips parted again, her voice barely above a whisper. She was right here. She was holding my hand. Julia felt her stomach drop. She had seen the girl too, so had Daniel, and yet the security footage had shown something impossible. No origin, no reflection, a presence that shouldn't have been there. Daniel stepped forward carefully, his voice gentle. Amelia, who was she? Amelia blinked slowly, as if her mind was piecing something together. She told me her name. She swallowed, her throat dry. Her name was Lily. Julia's breath caught. Something about that name sent a chill down her spine. She had heard it before, somewhere in this very hospital. One of the older nurses, Margaret, gasped softly. Lily. Oh my God. Everyone turned to her. Margaret looked pale, her hands clutching the railing of Amelia's bed. Lily Carter, Amelia's sister. Silence filled the room. Daniel felt his heart stop for a second. Her sister, Margaret, nodded, her expression filled with something between fear and sorrow. Lily Carter was admitted here years ago. She was just a little girl when she fell sick. A rare illness. Her body was too weak to fight it off. She hesitated before finishing. She passed away in this very hospital. Daniel and Julia exchanged a glance, their thoughts racing. The pieces were falling into place, but it still didn't make sense. Amelia's breath was shaky. I remember now. I saw her before the accident. She was standing at the side of the road. I thought I was dreaming. Tears welled in Julia's eyes as she realized what had happened. She wasn't a dream, Amelia. Amelia looked down at her hand, the very spot where the little girl had touched her. She woke me up, she whispered. The weight of the moment was heavy. Everyone in the room felt it. Whatever had happened tonight, whatever had brought Amelia back, was beyond medical explanation. Margaret wiped her eyes. Lily must have been watching over her all this time, waiting for the right moment. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice barely steady. She wasn't lost. She wasn't wandering. She came back for her sister. A strange calmness settled in the room. There was no fear anymore, just an overwhelming sense of something bigger than any of them could explain. The next few days were a blur. Amelia recovered faster than anyone expected. The doctors called it a miracle, but Daniel and Julia knew better. They never spoke of what they saw on the security footage, never tried to explain what had happened that night. And the little girl? She was never seen again. One evening, as Amelia sat by the hospital window, she smiled softly. "Thank you, Lily," she whispered to the quiet air, and for just a second, in the reflection of the glass, she swore she saw her sister smiling back. And then, just like that, she was gone. Some stories don't need an explanation. Some moments are simply meant to be felt, to be believed, and for those who witnessed it, one truth remained: love, even beyond life, never fades.